as teams are assembling their new rosters for the season, I thought it was high time to once again highlight a specific type of personality or leader or component of a team indeed, which seems to be necessary in how you want to build your roster. Now, I've seen instances where this is not necessarily the case, but let's first lay out the raw concept I want to talk about today. So, there seems to be, from talking to coaches, as well as in the Overwatch League, as well as the Tier 2 scene and contenders, there seems to be a need for an emotional leader. So someone that sort of regulates the temperature, if you will, of any given social situation within comms, during scrims, or whatever, right? Someone that sort of, I hesitate to use that phrase, but lead the pack and sort of tell them, not necessarily strategically, but emotionally where we are going, basically, and what to follow. Now, as I said, the emotional leader doesn't necessarily have to be the shot caller. For instance, one famous example was in CSGO, we had the team Cloud9, and there were two players in that team. One of them went by Sean Gears, he's now an on-screen analyst, as well as Freakazoid, who was more like the type of guy, very outgoing, muscular, very upfront personality. You know, it's just a presence that is very hard to overlook. And famously, they had a clip at an event, and it was basically a situation where comms were going wild, right? And calls weren't necessarily taken, and it was quite frustrating for the leader itself. And then Freakazoid comes out and says, okay guys, we need to listen to Sean, trust Sean, basically. That is very much paraphrased, but the essence of this idea is that the emotional leader can give authority and regulate what is happening inside comms. So it's not necessarily the case that the emotional leader should be shot calling. He can, but it isn't a necessity for him to be a strategical mastermind, as long as he can redirect that attention towards the actual shot caller. It's also the case that the emotional leader, most of the time, is someone of varying ability. You can be the emotional leader by being the best player on the team. That's quite rare, right? Because talking and sort of reading the social situation while at the same time playing world class has not been seen as much, but certainly would be a big boon. Because there's also the instance where the emotional leader is one of the worst players in their team, and in that situation, it might really hurt your team. Because the way social structures then are created around in that team makes it very hard to eject that emotional leader, because once again you have to build up that hierarchy that exists within your team, if you indeed need it. If you're a very homogeneous group, you might get away without it, or your coach might be the emotional leader in that sense, but then you're sort of relegated to situations between games where the comms are open and you can talk in the hideout, at least in the Overwatch scene, right? So, let's talk a little bit about the tasks that an emotional leader had. So definitely, and that was echoed by a lot of Overwatch League and Tier 2 coaches, is the ability to read a social situation, to sort of feel out the temperature and see, is someone more nervous or more agitated in that situation? Can he calm him down? Can he wake up someone from a trance of playing? Certainly, probably everyone knows how it is to play on autopilot. The emotional leader recognizes these things and wakes up people from that trance, which you can very easily fall into. He basically regulates and also, to a degree, and I guess that's a badly connotated word, but manipulates his teammates into a healthy state of mind. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. And in all actual fact, this video could have also been titled An Apology to Asuka, Because the prime example of someone that was an emotional leader, again and again over many games, demonstrated that he brings that special component towards his teams, which make up for championship rosters, is obviously Esker. Now, the guy was definitely not one of the best players on his team, because, for one, Lunatic High at the time was pretty stacked in terms of talent, especially in the front and the back line. And then, obviously, he had Who Are You in one season and Guido in the other. Especially Who Are You, one of the best players in the world. So, you would have to say that Esker was probably one of the worst players on this team, which then after the fact also created that issue, because if there is a player that is the emotional leader but he's not good enough to play on the level that the other guys are, well, suddenly you need to possibly eject this player and you need to build the entire roster once again, or the social components, but it is like, it's very hard to slot someone into that who can read. It also takes time to develop for the emotional leader to sort of frame the social situation around him, find his place, demand authority, also earn authority and respect. This takes time most of the time. Unless you're a very special kind of personality, it takes time to click, and it certainly helps if you have charisma, but you also, the part of the emotional leader is also to know what your teammates are like, and then to react accordingly. Because if the emotional leader is not doing his job, if he's constantly suffocating someone's emotion or suppressing it, instead of almost like in a judo move, use it towards his advantage, right? And once again, the emotional leader needs to know that. For instance, there were examples, especially in CSGO once again, where players played much better when they were angry, such as Olaf Meister. Maybe in those situations, if that actually doesn't hurt your overall team performance, and you would have to have an empirical idea if that's the case, you might as well like let him go off and let him rage and let him dominate the team in that mindset. Maybe you even steer him on and try to get him there. The emotional leader needs to be able to read that situation. Now, this aggressive approach doesn't seem to be conclusive so far in Overwatch from what I've seen, because the game is so communication intensive, but it certainly isn't impossible that this like sort of spurring on component of the emotional leader might eventually come to pass in the game of Overwatch, right? So far, as I've heard, most coaches prefer if the emotional leader has a read on the current social situation and then says, okay guys, reset, new engagement, what can we do? Get out of the mindset. Don't stop blaming each other, right? Stop not talking to each other. Let's go, let's go. Basically, someone that either revitalizes or dampens the mood, depending on what the situation is and what your team requires to function at a high level. Right? So, let's talk a little bit about famous examples. I mean, one of the famous examples, for instance, in real-world sports, was, for instance, 2014. The German soccer team was led by Philipp Lahm, who was the captain at the time, but he wasn't necessarily the emotional leader. The emotional leader, and we actually called him in Germany something like this, was actually Bastian Schweinsteiger. So how did he do that? Basically, of course, communication is limited as a football player because you can't scream over the entire field, and but it's also something that you do through your play, courageous stuff, right? It's possibly less feasible in Overwatch because you have to understand like some courageous plays. How courageous is it really? What Schweinsteiger did was actually threatening his own health in order to further the team. He got a cut even during the final game, if I'm not mistaken, and he's continued on playing, and just through sheer power of will sort of ripped people out of the trance and really got them to follow him, right? He led by example. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Yes, the emotional leader obviously needs to follow his own directions and also needs to assess his own emotional situation. And an emotional leader that is unstable is actually also very, very volatile for the state of a team. But if he can manage himself and then manage others, that's a huge boon for every team, right? So certainly that needs to be a component when team building, right? It's not just enough that coaches know how to facilitate players in terms of strategy or tactics. It's also, what is the social components? Can we do this over this long season? Yes, as it looks like the seam has been shortened a little bit in terms of play, but we saw that there was a lot of, you know, tension in between teams, and as I pointed out on Twitter, if you guys read this, it might even be conclusive to better play that there is tension constantly. But when it comes to playing high-level Overwatch, you could have found the entire season, if you get to playoffs and shot call and also emotionally regulate people when it matters, that's basically the golden goose, right? So I already mentioned Eska. Now let's talk about a couple of other instances where we know that, for instance, someone is an emotional leader. Certainly one has to say the negative case, in a sense, to this was Sebosai. Sebosai was, for instance, reported by Reinforce that he was sort of like this type of archetypical leader within Misfits, and he did quite well at that. He was well regarded, well liked, and led the guys. The problem was his own level of play wasn't up to snuff. You could argue that, I think it's reasonable to say that him and Zappe were the second worst backline in the Overwatch League. So what do you do if your emotional leader can't bring it anymore? Now, one way is to apparently eject the entire team, and given the level of play that the other people showed, with possibly the exception of Manaton and Logix, I guess that was a feasible solution. But at the same time, it's very hard then to like just take out Sebosai and slot someone else in, who then becomes the emotional leader. Previously, it could have been Tivik, I'm sure. I'm not 100%, by the way, if Sebosai was actually the emotional leader. This is obviously information I got from appearances that Reinforce had. I believe it was an Oversight where he talked about this. But, like, if that was the case, yes, it's very hard to regulate it in that case, because your emotional leader just doesn't cut it, and then you have to reconstruct, or, in fact, build from scratch. Now, other emotional leaders we've heard from is, for instance, Custer. Custer comes into the Valiant and is able to structure comms, be positive, and whatever, right? So that is quite interesting how that then turned out, that Valiant over the season also slightly improved, which, by the way, were already pretty okay in Stage 1 and Stage 2. And then, obviously, once they got Custer, it seemed to certainly be going upwards. But at the same time, once again, a lot of tension within the team, and ultimately they came together, couldn't go all the way, but definitely made it to playoffs, had a pretty good Stage 4, and that is a commendable, or a commendable achievement, isn't it? So, another player that possibly stands out is obviously Jake as a leader. Jake, one could say, had the problem that his hero pool was unfortunately not suited often in the meta. Obviously, yes, the Junkrat mattered a lot. And then if you looked at their win percentages, I think with Jake, they also had like significantly more success. Because if you are the emotional leader as well as the shot caller, that's obviously a huge component to take out. Suddenly, like, if that vacuum of talking exists, that's certainly a problem. Another emotional leader that we heard about before in the past, and one could argue that there were possibly too many within Dallas Fuel, was certainly Taimu, right? So when Taimu has his confidence, he can shot call while playing a world-class DPS. When Taimu is not on, he's sucked out of that system, and now you have to sort of work without this component existing. Pretty much the same thing for Cox. Cox was famously shot calling with high energy during it must have been the Season 2 finals against Lunatic High, where Runaway seemed to be looking to win the series, and Cox was all out shot calling. Then the final dragged out. His energy level dropped off. His ability to emotionally interact with people, but I guess there it was more a sense of shot calling, then dropped off or lost effect over a longer period of time, and they famously lost the final because of that, possibly because of that. At least that is the reason they gave in hindsight. Also, Runner did at the time. Certainly, Runner probably was a pretty good person to feel out the temperature there. It doesn't necessarily have to be a single entity within a team. If there's two people who can sort of, you know, check each other, that's also a great component, and also has been relayed to me that this quite often happens, that you don't have this one guy that leads the group, but it's two guys, and they check each other, and they then, most of the time, then one of them is the shot caller. But yeah, that is also feasible. That human hierarchy is apparently a lot also for that, right? Overall, I have to say, I hope that teams also vet for that. I think it's quite possible that it's much better to get an average player or slightly above average player who is this type of personality, who you can imagine building the emotional structure of your team around. Let's say social structure. I don't like to focus too much on the emotional part, but to focus the social structure around him, where you can imagine that he's very meta resistant as a constant component of your roster, and that you can build the team around. I've heard concepts of anchor players around these teams now being mentioned, and where teams say, okay, we may sell the others, but these are the emotional as well as gameplay anchor points we want to focus our season around. So certainly, especially the less experienced expansion slots, and here I'm especially talking to the ownership, would do well in sort of considering that component of team building as well. I also have to say, I never really felt this to be as big of a component as it is in Overwatch. I think legitimately, Overwatch is an esport, emphasizes communication, and of course for components such as one player more, or in some cases even 3 players more than 3v3 esports, right? It is much more important to have clean communication, to have a clean social structure, at least when it gets to being in the game, being in the moment. Outside, okay, that's fine. You can butt heads, and something fruitful can come out from that collision, but when it's game time, you gotta be on the same page. You gotta have someone to follow. It doesn't necessarily need to be the guy that calls the strategy. Someone needs to regulate the temperature, and that is the emotional leader. Thanks for watching.